Good morning. Oh, excuse me. I'm Melanie Giesler. I'm with the Institute for Applied Ecology, and I'm going to be moderating this session. There's been another room change. So this session is the climate change and restoration general session. And so if you're in the wrong room, this would be a good time to change. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. It's Stephanie Frischie from the Xerces Society, and she's going to be presenting on seed sourcing strategies for restoration under climate change. Stephanie?
Good morning. Yes, I'm Stephanie Frischie. I'm on behalf of all the other co-authors listed here. I'm going to be sharing some of the results of a literature review that we did. There is a QR code here. It's for a brief survey. It's just for fun, so totally optional. But if you do source seeds for projects, that's a survey asking a few questions. We presented this topic about a month ago at a huge conservation conference in Chicago with about 2,000 attendees, and so we did use that survey there. As I said, I'm gonna just quickly go through who our working group is, and we call ourselves Growing Through Change. Give a bit of background and overview of what seed sourcing strategies are conceptually, share with you the literature review we did, and then also follow up with the recommendations and the call to action from that literature review and time for Q&A. Here is our working group. We all have a nexus in the Chicago area. 5 out of the 6 of us were trained at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and Becky is now on the faculty there. And we all work in, a few of us are solely researchers, but many of us have both research and practitioner hats that we wear. So with that in mind, our goal was really to synthesize some of the research on seed sourcing and boil that down into good guidelines that practitioners in the Chicago region or the Midwest or even beyond others working in the tallgrass prairie ecosystem could be able to put to use on the ground. So here's a slide that shows kind of the target audience that we're thinking about with this and some of the questions that they may be asking when they're making decisions around sourcing. And then as far as constraints, even though the Midwest is blessed with a relatively robust seed supply chain and a fairly long history of ecological restoration, there's still many constraints here. And I do have to, lack of information, that's a very vague way of covering a lot of things that we don't have information about. In some cases, we don't really know because the information was never collected or attached to a seed lot. We don't know what the source of that is. There's variability in what future climate predictions are, so it's hard to aim for that, depending on how much uncertainty there is there. This figure, there's a lot to take in here. It's adapted from a paper by Bukharova et al., and this is conceptual here, but if you look at the colors as climate gradients, and then the circles that have the thicker solid black outline, those are the restoration site, the site to be restored, and the circles with the dashed or dotted borders, those are the source populations of seeds that are used at the restoration site. So there is, I'm going to go back to Beth Ledger's Reno and gambling, or Nevada and gambling analogies here. Things like admixture, you can see there's multiple source populations, as well as climate adjusted and composite and regional. Those in some ways are all forms of bet hedging, right? You're putting multiple eggs from different chickens in your basket. And then local is basically like not betting at all, like you're good with what you have. And predictive is putting all your chips on the table. You feel confident enough about what your odds are that you choose one source that's adapted to future conditions, and that's what you use at your site. This is a summary then. I started to say this. We're really looking to provide management practices for managers, land managers, and the practitioners by summarizing the research that's already out there. So we did a literature review. And maybe not totally unsurprisingly, but a bit disappointingly, there was little information about the species and systems of Chicago, the tallgrass prairie, and the Midwest. And the other kind of big finding we had were a few other patterns that emerged. So despite our intentions, this effort turned out to be more of a gap analysis and then a call to action for some additional steps we want to take support in the Chicago region. Here is our paper on this review that was published last year. It's open access, so if you're interested, you can find that there. And a bit of our methods here. I wasn't going to remember all of these numbers, so I put them on the slide. And now I can't quite see the screen down there. But we just did the typical research review process, systematic review. We had our main search terms and came up with over 2,000 papers. We had criteria that we were later going to use when we scored those papers. We used the Rayan interface to include or exclude papers. And then once we got it down to 176, we actually took all the data of interest to us from those experimental papers. Here are some of our results. So yeah, we figured that forest biomes and tree species were likely the ones that had been studied experimentally the most in reference to how does provenance and climate variables, how do those interact in terms of performance? Those trees are longer lived, so there's more of a commitment there when you're choosing what the source material is. And there's, of course, been more of an economic interest in trees and forest species in particular. The other graph here shows the history that we tracked and how long this topic has been studied. You can see starting in the 2000s, there's a real explosion in looking at provenance and the impact of climate variables on performance variables. And you do start to pick up some species whose life history is not tree, but still dominated by trees there. Some similar data, just broken down in a different way. What life stage of the plant was studied by those life history groups here. And you can see many studies were looking at seeds or seedlings. Some looked at both. And then this is a word cloud, again, just demonstrating the tree or forest emphasis on this research topic. Larger fonts meant more hits from that journal. And in terms of the 10 most frequent species that were studied, these all tended to be conifers of economic importance. And then how long did the experiments run in the papers that we reviewed? So our scale here is months out to more than 10 years. And for trees, some of them were very short. They were maybe even just measuring seed weight or germination and emergence. For the forb and graminoid studies, which again are the life histories that we were most interested in, these were pretty short, especially from the perspective of ecological restoration, where you're more interested in reproductive fitness and persistence. The duration of studies were 3 months to as long as only 1 to 2 years. This figure summarizes the predictor variables that we counted. And of course, provenance was the most frequent, and that is because that was one of the requirements for a study being included in our review, as well as there needed to be some factor related to climate and an experimental treatment. And then There were 249 different response variables in these papers. We categorized them according to the list that you see here on the left of the bars. And most of those were vegetative, all kinds of biomass measurements collectively. And like I said, are these necessarily the traits of interest for restoration ecology? In Beth's talk, of course, she's looking a lot at size and competition and coexistence as well. But, things like reproductive traits and just persistence would be interesting to have more empirical data on as well. All right, the big question then, did performance vary between provenances? And, well, yeah, approximately half of the papers, or 53%, did report a significant difference. Moving on now then to some of the recommendations or the call to action that came out of this. There are 7 ones that we want to highlight here. And that first is the information piece, either collecting properly and then keeping that information attached to the seed is information about the provenance. And that's important because you need to know where it came from if you're going to measure how it performed and relate that back to where it came from. The second is species distribution modeling. This is something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about toward the very end here. Another suggestion that we have, again, would be working through regional seed networks or programs. They can help on coordinating and making sure that wild populations are not over-collected, and also between organizations and projects of moving around different source provenances appropriately. Dynamic seed transfer zones, seed transfer zones in general are not something that are used a lot in the Midwest. Our climate and topography aren't as complex as the West, and often a lot of the projects are focused on more local sourcing. And then, increased integration between practice and theory. We have a similar idea to what Beth talked about this morning. Every restoration can be an experiment as long as we have certain information and some type of experimental design and question attached to that. So that's something also that we're working on back home in the Chicago area, is partnering better with restoration projects to answer some of these performance questions of interest. Addressing additional research needs goes kind of hand in hand with number 5. And then the last is encouraging practitioners to participate and share their data in some of these restoration project databases. This is where a lot of outcomes can be gathered and measured and shared across users. So finally here, some of our future directions. I said I'd talk a little bit more about species distribution modeling. We're organizing a brief curriculum and some training workshops related to this for the Chicago region. We hope we can crowdsource it by working with GIS and biogeography courses and having students do these as class projects, so it'd be a crowdsourced effort. And we begin to get a picture of where a species occurs currently and how many X years into the future, how that range is expected to shift. And that would be helpful in guiding practitioners and making some of these sourcing decisions as well. And then we have another survey in the works to more deeply understand what are the factors going into sourcing choices that the practitioners are making. And with that, I'm all done. Yeah, thank you. Any questions? I don't see any. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yep. I don't know if can I go back? There we go. And I'll let you all know here, B Global Restore and C Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. I don't believe those are, the sites are there, but they're not quite accepting data yet. So just wanted to give you a heads up about the status of those.
Okay, if you're just coming in, this is the Climate Change and Restoration General Session, and I'd like to welcome our next speaker. It's Tren Hagman with Granite Seed Company, and he's going to be talking about wildland seed collections, seed transfer zones, permits, and partnerships. Tren?
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, my name's Tren Hagman. I'm with Granite Seed Company. I've been with Granite for 14 years, and I now manage our 3 Granite Seed locations. Let's see if I can figure this thing out. Okay, yeah, so here's just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about here. I'm going to give you a background on Granite Seed Company, talk about our 2022 collection kind of data that I had put together on those, and then also touch on the historical information we've always gathered on our wildland collections, and then some of the new information that we're starting to collect on these collections that have just in the last 5 to 7 years started being requested. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that we face on our wildland collections. Of those challenges, permit acquisition being one of the larger ones, so I'm going to spend a little more time on that one, and then also the partnerships that we've developed from the acquisition of those permits, and then hopefully I leave enough time for some questions from you guys. Okay, so Granite Seed was founded in 1988. It was a acquisition of the seed part of Native Plants Incorporated, who had been around for 15 years prior to that, I believe. The owner that originally acquired it was in Arizona at the time. Eventually, the headquarters moved to Lehi, Utah. That was a good takeoff point for distribution throughout the Great Basin and surrounding areas, where a lot of the reclamation and restoration work was happening at that time. In the early days, the collections were a big part of what we were doing, but we weren't doing those in-house. It was other companies we were buying that product from that specialized in wildland collections. Since then, we now have probably 90% of our collections in-house that we do on our own throughout the Western U.S. We also have our own production in Washington and Montana for a lot of the grasses, and the shrubs and forbs are the ones that we're targeting on our wildland collections. They're ones that are more difficult to produce in a field setting. And we've also opened a Denver, Colorado distribution warehouse and a Tempe, Arizona one as well since then. And we are now part of a larger group of companies. Native Seed Group, we're a collection of 11 companies with 13 locations. We have 4 farming operations, the Montana and Washington operation, and then 2 additional ones in California now. We also have a small production farm in Mexico, where we do a lot of our production on forbs for the Arizona, Sonoran, and the desert areas down south. Collectively, we annually move over 11 million pounds of seed. Of our group, 7 of us are focused mainly on natives, and the others, we do have one that's more ag-based and then some flower production at some of the others. That 11 million pounds equates to about 350,000 acres treated on an annual basis, with 30,000 plus customers that we're servicing throughout the Western U.S. So in 2022, our collections, it was a rough year. It was a dry year. So we were down a lot from what we typically collect. But with that being said, even with it being dry, there was still good production on a lot of the stands that we collected on. So we acquired 80 permits in total. And of those 80, 20 of them we never collected on a lot of it was due to the drought conditions. The stands looked good early on, and then we didn't get any late moisture. And so those plants just didn't produce. So we didn't target 20 of the sites that we had planned on. And that is a high number for us. It's usually around 5 to 10 of permits we don't end up using. So like I said, a lot of that was due to the drought. So for the 60 permits we did end up collecting on, it was 50 unique species. There was a handful of species where we had multiple site collections on. That equated to that all of our collections were across 8 western states and in northern Mexico as well. That was across 11 unique ecoregions and 35 plus seed transfer zones. The total clean pounds we ended up with was over 145,000 clean pounds. The in-dirt pounds was closer to 250,000, and then we processed that down and ended up with the 145,000. Our largest collection last year was 25,000 pounds, and our smallest one was 25. So we're targeting larger collections on a lot of our sites. The 25 is not a typical one for us. It's usually a more specialized species we're looking at when it's smaller pounds like that. And like I said, we are targeting the shrubs and forbs that we cannot have either tried in field production and they just didn't work out, or we've tried them and have found they just don't produce the seed. So we're targeting those for collections because we can get more pounds and make more available on the market of those particular species. These numbers don't include some targeted collections we're doing for custom grow outs. There are a small amount of those where we are collecting the material to grow out and increase for certain restoration practitioners. So those numbers from last year don't include those, and there weren't very many, 2 or 3, I believe. So historically, the information that we have collected or gathered on our collected material has been pretty standard stuff. I mean, the species, the state of origin, and county of origin, and then we try to accurately record the elevation and annual precip of those sites. And then if the site was pre-inspected by the Department of Ag for Source ID certification, we historically had that certification associated with the lot. And now within the last 5 to 7 years, we've got more detailed in our record keeping on our collections. It's mostly due to the demand for that information from our customers. They want to know more finite details of where our collected materials are coming from. So we have GPS coordinates of all of our collection sites, and then those help us record the other information. So that bottom map is the level 3 ecoregion map. So we're recording the ecoregion for every collection lot that we have, and then also the seed transfer zones, and that's the map on the right. So we have an ecoregion and seed transfer zone for each collection site, as well as we have the Source ID certification on there, but we also are keeping our site inspection attached to that lot if anyone's requesting that, as well as our permit that we acquired to get permission to go collect that lot. So we have a lot more detail, as well as the previous information we were collecting. So we've almost doubled the amount of information we are keeping on every collection lot that we have. So some of the challenges that we face in our wildland collection program, the biggest one is just timing it correctly. We'll start scouting early March, and we start in Arizona and kind of work our way north throughout the season. So we'll start in March scouting stands. If it looks promising, we'll go back 3, 4, 5 times on occasion, depending on the species, and kind of monitor if it's ready. So the challenge we have is timing it correctly. We don't want to get there too early, and we don't want to get there too late. We want to hit it just right so we can get viable seed and have a good test and a good clean product to offer. The other challenge we face is weather, and that's throughout the entire season. Last year was super dry, so we fight those conditions, but then wet years or rains or windstorms, it's always something. There's a challenge pretty much throughout the year. And then later in the year with our sagebrush and for those later flowering forbs, we have the challenge of snow. And last year we did have an early snow event, in October that shut down a few of those sites we were targeting as well. So weather's a big challenge as well. And then also accurately tracking all that information that was on those previous slides. That's a challenge for us. We have some processes set up now that is making that a lot easier for us, where we can get that information in early, and then it stays on the lot as it runs through our processing line, and we just have that available throughout the entire process. Another challenge for us with more call for local ecotypes is just balancing our everyday need of certain species and not getting caught up in targeting really fine, seed transfer zone ecoregion material. We have to balance, those efforts on getting those where we have a demand for it, but our larger demand is typically not as finite. It's okay over a larger region. So just balancing how many pounds we're getting from certain sites and not getting distracted too much on smaller collections from specific areas. So that's a challenge we're kind of working through as a company, is balancing getting more ecotypes available for the industry, but then at the same time having the pounds we've always had available. And we are seeing a shift in that, so that's why we're balancing that as we go. Another challenge is permit acquisition. So every collection we do, we have to have a permit, whether it's Forest Service, BLM, tribal lands, even on private lands. I mean, you've got to have the permit. We can't just go in wherever we want and start picking up seeds. So that's one of our biggest challenges is the permit acquisitions. So our process for permit acquisitions, I mean, once we find a stand and we've monitored it, we've checked it a couple times. Ideally, we check it one time if we think it's looking promising and we think we have enough time to acquire that permit prior to collection. Then we got to find out who owns that land. Federal lands are pretty straightforward. You can find a beginning contact fairly easy. The private lands are a little trickier. There is software available like Onyx that we've found helpful for finding out who, or at least a starting point for who owns that land. And then from there, it can be 3 weeks of calls, and finally you get told no, and you've just wasted a bunch of time, and now we're scrambling to look for other stands. So, and that's usually more on the private side. The other challenge we have with federal lands is every field office, every forest, every ranger district is different, and finding the correct contact is the challenge we have there. The good part, though, is once we find that, we now have that. So next year, if we want to go on that same district, same field office, we now have that contact until they move on, and then we're starting over and trying to find that again. So those are the challenges with permits that we face. But during that process, we developed these partnerships. Like I was saying, with the government agencies, once you find that right contact, it makes it a lot easier. And then we keep record of that. And if it does change, it makes it easier to keep track of who's now in charge of that, or if they even allow collection. There's some field offices that just don't allow collections. In fact, let me go back here. I just wanted to show an example. Where did we have it? No. Anyways, one of these slides was a picture of a stand-up Frischie crenulata. That just happened this year, and it was on state trust land. Yeah, this right here. So that's a stand-up Frischie crenulata that we were hoping to collect on. And luckily that sign was real close to the site, so we made a call. Turns out they don't allow collections. So that's the kind of things that we are dealing with, where you get real hopeful, you have a stand that you're excited about, and then it turns out there's just no way to get that permit. So that happens all the time to us. And then with private landowners, when we finally get a hold of the correct contact, we develop these relationships, and they're long lasting most of the time. Like sometimes they'll just call us and say, hey, you guys collected last year, that same stand's looking good, or there's another stand of something else that they're just calling to see if we're interested in. And a lot of times they're doing some restoration work on their property, and so we work out a trade deal, or they end up being a customer and buy that seed from us. And a lot of times they have other properties throughout the states, and so it opens up some other lands to be able to go collect that seed on. And with that, I will take any questions you guys have. Yeah.
What's the process you were talking about for tracking all the information?
The process, it starts with the GPS points because a lot of that we can get from that. So our field crews are ensuring that they get that information and then it's sent to the office, and then we can use those maps to find out the sea transfer zone, the ecoregion, and then elevations of the sites. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. What steps does your company take to prevent over-harvesting of natural stands? Like, do you collect from the same sites over 30 years?
We do. And it's really dependent on the agencies. They have like protocols we follow. You know, a certain percentage of plants can only be harvested. But the stands we're targeting are really large stands. And we can never really collect the whole thing. So, I mean, we're usually probably between like 20 to 30% of a stand that we're collecting off of. Yeah.
So, when you get a request in from an agency for seed, how strict are they on the seed zones in terms of are they allowing some adjacent seed zones or is it pretty strict?
So the BLM is the main one that has started requesting that material. They have multiple seed zones they're looking at. And I mean, I don't know their evaluation process for sure, but the industry basically is offering all the zones that we've collected. I mean, we're not the only ones doing it. There's several other companies. And so they're picking from that. I'm sure if the specific one they want is not available, they're probably narrowing it down to proximity. Yeah, in the very back.
On private lands, you guys take into account any restoration history that may have gone on there? So, for instance, in the southeast, I've got to look at, find out if that site has probably been seeded with some other ditch somewhere else. You guys run into a lot of that sort of thing up there?
So a lot of the sites on private aren't, they're not typically disturbed lands. They're usually a farmer or rancher that has an operation, and the sites we're targeting are kind of on the perimeters of those areas. So there may have been stands that were seeded years ago, 15, 20 years ago. We don't really have a good way of tracking that on private. When you get to like some state lands, like the Division of Wildlife has a good record keeping process on their site. So if we're targeting a site like that, we can go check that database.
You talked about a balancing act that you have to strike between what I would call commodity sort of broad scale seed versus the more boutique seed that we talk a lot about at this conference.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you had to strike a balance, and it wasn't clear to me whether the demand that you described as shifting towards the boutique side, or is it, I presume, is that
Yes, yeah, that's correct. It's shifting more towards the transfer zone, ecoregion based, where in the past it was, state county origin based is kind of how we looked at it. And the preference wasn't necessarily given to that. It was more the native species itself.
So the question I'm really interested in is, you strike this balance, I presume, for a variety of reasons. One is to respond to demand, but another, I suppose, is to service your bottom line as well. Can you give us an indication of whether one, like, are you sponsoring the boutique supply and funding it with the commodity supply, or I mean, is one or the other a better business for you?
Currently, the former is that's where more of our volume is currently. But like I said, that is where the shift is coming. So we're trying to get ahead of that and get more variety or more options from certain transfer zones that have shown to be in demand for our areas.
That's all the time we have for questions.
Okay, yeah.
Up next, we have Haley Smith with the Dorina Genetic Resource Center with the U.S. Forest Service. And Haley will be talking about climate change impacts and the mediation techniques for a sustainable seed supply in Central American countries.
Can you tell me how this works? Ooh. Technical difficulties, I apologize. Okay. Arrows. Hi everyone, my name is Haley Smith. I'm from Dorina Genetic Resource Center. We are a Forest Service facility that mainly specializes in disease-resistant breeding. For the past several years, I've been able to work closely with international programs on some of the work we've been able to do with Central American countries regarding seed bank development and improvement. Today I'm just going to talk to you about some of the takeaways that our group has come up with over the few workshops we've been able to do over the past few years. So the CAFTA-DR agreement has a strong agricultural focus that really wants to look at improving the science of forestry in Central American countries. And that has allowed for international programs, which is in the Forest Service and the state program, to start doing a series of workshops, trainings, and insight visits and seed bank assessments to help them improve their seed bank building capacity. This has continued in person, and then of course it's gone on through the pandemic and worked remotely. So the group that I've been working with most recently is Vicki Erickson and Andy Bauer, who are geneticists with the Forest Service, to work on developing seed banks and improving the knowledge that they can use for seed collection, storage, transfer guidelines, and of course storing that material appropriately. So we're going to talk about climate change, and I know we've been talking about that a lot this week, but I think there are a lot of novel things that we will find when we are actually looking at the experiences and difficulties that Central American countries are going through that are above and beyond that which we have actually had to deal with in temperate North America. This is a global risk assessment that was done by Germanwatch between '94 and 2013, just assessing the impacts of climate change. And you'll notice there are 5 Central American countries listed in the top 12 countries that have had the most severe impact. So some of the things that we're going to talk about are going to sound really similar, but I did want to talk about some of the ways in which they're experiencing climate change differently and have to moderate their collection differently than what we do. So I'm sure these maps look a little familiar. We're expecting, of course, so on the left we have current, and then on the right we have what's the expected changes based on RCP 8.5. I use that one because I'm a negative person. So, but it seems to be the more realistic model these days. It used to be our worst case scenario. So mean annual temperature, of course, is expected to increase in several areas and throughout Central America, and then we're also expecting to see overall a decrease in mean annual precipitation. So the areas in Central America are often made up of either grasslands, savannas, mountain areas, or tropical areas, and what we're expecting to see is a shift in those areas to impact more grasslands and less canopy in the future. So we're also expecting to see a decrease in precipitation, especially in those drier times of year. The dry times are going to get drier. Similar to the Amazon, Central America is expected to have a decreased forest cover due to this. We're going to see increased tree mortality. That's going to change the forest structure dramatically. Let's see, Costa Rica and Panama, they seem to have a relatively large annual precipitation, and so they seem to, based on current models, be a little more resilient to this climate change is what we're expecting to occur. But we are expecting other countries to exhibit a larger increase in savanna and grassland. So those are the predictions, but there's a cascade of effects that we can't directly predict based on modeling that's going to affect seed development, germination that occur on a microsite climate. So soil moisture and temperature with those changing canopies are obviously going to shift. We're going to see an increase in tree mortality, an decrease in tree cover. We're going to be shifting nutrient cycling based on the changes in inputs and the changes of temperature. We're going to see a lengthening of the dry season that could be much more catastrophic to certain species than other. Wildfire and hurricane intensity, herbivory, especially on stress trees, pollinator dieback or loss, or even losing interest on changing substances that a pollinator may consume. There's changes in nectar we're expecting to see. And of course, plant phenology. So this is going to affect the seed supply that is available in these countries in novel ways as well. So increasing tree mortality, that means we're going to need to replant more in these areas. We're going to see a decrease in seed quality due to a decrease in pollination, changes in phenology, and stressed trees produce poor quality seed. Decreases in outplanting success potentially, which is going to shift the outplanting timeline, and a shift in species. So to combat this, seed banks are really interested in this area in gathering more information on climate change solutions. So they're working to adapt their collection timelines. They're working to cross-border share a lot of their seed supply. They want to increase their seed storage capacities. They've started reopening seed banks that had been shuttered in the 90s and expanding the seed supply in that way, and increasing the efficacy of local nurseries. So it's all going to start with what they need to collect. Species of high economic or social value are going to be of critical importance, of course. High germplasm value, we need to start thinking about seed orchard parents or disease resistance in a novel way for these novel species. Rare endemic species, similar to temperate North America, are always going to be at higher risk. Species populations threatened by overharvesting, theft, habitat loss, wildfire, disease, insects, and agriculture, of course. We're expecting to see more fragmented or disjunct populations. And as a reminder, in tropical areas, larger trees are more at risk to die off due to stress. So collecting from those larger trees first and foremost might be of more importance. So this is going to impact plant communities as well. Plants with cold stratification requirements may not break dormancy. Some species types, including legumes, have different impacts or are more resistant to wildfire, but they also may have less moisture during these drier times, so they might not be germinating on a similar cycle. And we're expecting to see phenology changes in flowering and seed set timing, which is going to impact our ability to collect on a reasonable timeline or an expected timeline that we have done historically. So just a few notes on phenology. Phenology is shifting dramatically in these areas. So there's a lot of different types of phenology or flowering that occurs. We have indirect flowering, which is a fairly common type. Ever flowering, which occurs a lot in true tropical species. So that's just consistently flowering, consistently producing fruit. They can do that when the weather systems are fairly stable. Gregarious flowering occurs on a landscape level, such as coffee, and non-seasonal flowering, that's an individual-based flowering, and then seasonal flowering is driven by environmental cues. So as we see the environment shifting, we expect that ever flowering, the true tropical species, these areas may become drier and be less viable. And also the seasonal flowering driven by environmental cues is going to have complexities in phenology and timing as well. Another thing I don't think we think about as much in temperate North America, especially with our tree species, is the heavy reliance on pollinators, in these areas. So this is a study that took place in Costa Rica, and it shows that about less than 3% of their tree species are pollinated by wind. And so what we have to think about is not just the appropriate range of these tree species and the appropriate environmental conditions of tree species, but also their pollinators as well. We're also expecting to see a shifting in nectar quality that may actually decrease the likelihood of these individuals pollinating plants at all, even if they are present. So collections are going to increasingly, we're going to need to be smart about our collections in the right and collect from the right place, put it in the right place, and collect in the right amounts. So we've been talking a lot about provisional seeds collection zones and seed transfer zones this week, which I think is fantastic. This was created by, this map was created by Andy Bauer, our geneticist, and it uses those same climatic data that we historically have used for temperate North America, which is aridity and mean winter lows. But the issue is, due to a disproportionate amount of research done in these areas, we don't necessarily know if these are the right environmental parameters. It's a good start, but we don't necessarily know if this is exactly what's driving seed distribution in these areas. So more research needs to be done in these regions. We've also already mentioned the seed lot selection tool, which is great. One small thing to point out is that the seed lot selection tool doesn't currently go into most parts of Central America. So this has yet to be a tool that can be utilized in that region. So more work needs to be done on this as well to allow for them to use the same tools that we almost take for granted at this point that we're capable of accessing at any point in time. So a common question that comes up when we're talking about this, and this is also true of North American species, is how much do we collect? How many seed is enough? And that's a very complex question, but it's important to at least have the mindset that we know that collecting from more populations is more important than collecting from within a lot within one population. So that's a really helpful tool in us being able to at least tell seed collectors, cross borders, have conversations, and look at different communities and be able to share those within other communities. Another thing to remember, this is true for us as well, is seed storage is more important than ever. Appropriately handled seed lasts longer in storage, and it ensures we're not storing seeds that are incapable of being stored. This is especially important in tropical areas. Depending on the literature you read, it can be 20 to 40% of species are considered recalcitrant, and a large amount of those are in Central American countries. So understanding that capability is a crucial element to helping these seed banks continue. Longer in storage time also just helps us with our resources of being able to collect over longer periods of time, and collecting appropriate data allows for climate smart deployment of seed. So this is something I'm sure most of us in this room know, is the concept of orthodox versus recalcitrant seed. However, there's a larger number of recalcitrant seed in these areas, which makes reforestation and restoration much more difficult in these areas because that adds a large amount of complexity. And a lot of our research as scientists has been done on orthodox species with seed storage, frankly, because it's easier. So that's something I feel like we really need to talk about. So this is the DeVitis et al. 2020 paper, and it's a great way to assess whether your seed bank or a seed source is considered recalcitrant or not. However, this requires a lot of seed, and it requires 5 years. So doing that on a faster timeline might be of importance, especially to these smaller seed banks that are just trying to do restoration on a scale. So this is obviously the Cadillac of methods to do. However, there is a faster method that has been shown to be effective on tropical plant species. This work was done in the Dominican Republic, and it uses 100 seed tests to assess desiccation tolerance. And it's pretty simple, and it was shown to be really effective for tropical species. And one thing that's a good reminder for everyone when we're talking about seed storage is going back to this seed viability equation. There's a whole lot of parameters, there's a lot of math and variables in there, but what's most important to remember is that there's only a couple that we can control, and that's temperature and that's moisture content. So we need to control that to the best of our ability. So we focused when we're teaching this about really simple methods that you can utilize at smaller seed banks to come up with those solutions. So we're talking about very inexpensive dehumidifiers. We're talking about using non-destructive methods of hygrometers so we can assess seed dryness. Some of these seed could be really rare, so we don't want to check moisture content destructively in an oven. So we talked about the use of a hygrometer and how you can use that, which will non-destructively assess the moisture content, roughly the moisture content of your seed. So simple hygienic practices in seed banks are still a crucial element to education for everyone, including these Central American countries. And a few notes, I kind of started on this already, but currently we have few alternatives, low-tech alternatives for desiccation-sensitive trees. And that's crucially important in these areas. As I told you, a large number of Central American tree species are desiccation intolerant. And we've focused our research in a way that has been detrimental to this work. So just consider that when you're looking at the work you do, whether you're thinking about recalcitrant species. So there are a few solutions that I kind of talked about with them, but none of them are terribly easy. So the best option is just rapidly planting your trees or your seed. Have a plan for them. Developing orchards for a continued harvest could be an option as well, so you don't have to continuously revisit sites. And cryogenic preservation that leads to micropropagation as well. So, just a note, the tropics contain most of the world's recalcitrant tree species, and we need to invest in that research. So similarly, we can apply a lot of this knowledge globally. A quality and robust seed supply is essential for the conservation, reforestation, and restoration of forest ecosystems and commercial trade. So in general, we need to work on assisting in developing these seed transfer guidelines to be more appropriate to the region itself and not simply taking the model we've used in North America and just applying it. And improving our capacities for collecting and appropriately storing seed, reducing information gaps on seed physiology, and working on the seed supply chain. The groups there are really excited about cross-boundary sharing, which they're going to need to do appropriate deployment of seed from various areas in the future. And so they're really working hard to create those relationships so seed can be shared appropriately. So I just want to say thanks to international programs for allowing us to do this work. Susan Stein was great in implementing it and allowing us to do that, so I really appreciate it, as well as my coworkers on this, Andy Bauer and Vicki Erickson, our geneticist. And if you have any hard questions, they will answer them for you. Oh, one question or none. Great. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Mike Conroy with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And Mike will be speaking about climate-adapted plant materials, practical innovation for an uncertain future.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, everybody. So my name is Mike Conroy. I work with Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. So this is a voluntary conservation organization in Northwest Oregon. I mostly do habitat restoration on private lands. I'm going to be talking to you about this climate adapted plant materials project. I've been working on this closely with a collaborator, Randy Lawrence with Clean Water Services. They're a storm and sewer utility, and they'll come back into this story later, and also working with Institute for Applied Ecology along with some other folks. On this first slide, I kind of just wanted to use this picture to kind of portray the context for what we're talking about here. You can see there's kind of this ag field that is off to the left in the frame. There's this area of reforestation, and then let's see if this pointer, you can kind of see, is that working like that? Anyways, the taller trees, that's where the river is, okay? So there's a sliver of a remnant riparian buffer there. Then there's the planting area, that's where I work. I'm mostly installing riparian buffers on private lands. And then there's usually an ag area next to it. So I'm gonna spend a little bit of time kind of setting the context for how I'm looking at this issue as a land manager. And then we'll go forward from there. So quick map, Tualatin River watershed, Northwest Oregon. It's kind of like a little microcosm of a watershed in one little county. You've got the forested upland, and then you've got the brown and the purple. This is showing kind of an agriculture and urban transition as it goes to Portland, Oregon, which is off to the east. So one thing I just want to mention is that we're a Mediterranean climate, so most of the rainfall is in the wintertime. Summers are extremely warm and droughty. And then the primary area that I'm going to focus on is this purple and brown area, kind of the lower elevation, kind of, this is where most of the population is, where most of the agriculture is, and really it's where a lot of the area where I'll be working. And it's about 20 miles across and 20 miles from top to bottom, north to south. So I mentioned that the key partner in this is a sewer and stormwater utility, Clean Water Services. And I want to talk about this a little bit more because it'll give some context into how we're looking at this issue. So essentially, they are receiving it's an ecosystem services model. So by generating shade along perennial waterways in the Tualatin River Basin, they generate credits that offset for, accelerate or temperature releases from downstream from wastewater treatment plants. So after they've cleaned the sewer and sewer water, goes back into the river. If it's at a higher temperature, we're offsetting that impact by growing shade. So the importance of this is that you can see that there's a dollar value tied to the shade that we're growing. So we kind of think of it a little bit like green infrastructure. So you've got these riparian corridors that you're getting all these other benefits from native plant communities. They're mentioned here. We've been talking about them a lot. But because it's kind of seen as green infrastructure, we really need these communities to be resilient, and it allows us to think maybe on a larger time scale. And so, we rely a lot on native plant materials to accomplish our objectives. So we're installing over 500,000 bare root trees and shrubs on an annual basis, about 70 cents a piece just for the plant material. So that's $350,000 a year just on trees and shrubs going into a 20 mile by 20 mile area. So I'm just pointing that out so that you can kind of see why we are interested in the resiliency of these plant communities long term. I put a little link up if you want to learn more about this Tualatin Basin story, but I kind of wanted to give that context. Okay, a little bit more about how we make these riparian buffers. So there's somebody in this picture, they're planting, they've got the bare root shovel and the planting bag. That guy would probably do 1,000 of those in a day. Like I think a lot of you all, we're still mostly working with this idea of historical reference communities. We do 2 years of site prep, and then we're putting out over 2,000 trees and shrubs per acre, working on moisture conservation around those, ring or line sprays, no irrigation, tubes, or mulch. And we're interested in what the outcome is that we're getting, but we're not looking at each individual plant that's going out on the landscape and whether or not it survives or not. I mean, that's definitely something that we're tracking, so we know, but it's not a measure of success for us. This is kind of this restoration methodology that is really, you know, I don't know what the word is, but it's really tied into the Willamette Valley. I mean, we've got really mesic climate, we've got awesome, you know, plant growers. We can do this at scale, and there's a write-up on it that I've got the link to in this paper. It's 10 years old, but what we're doing really hasn't changed a whole lot. So I'm trying to paint a picture that we've got reliable funding and how that leads into reliable plant materials, and how we're able to think about things on a long time scale. So we manage plant materials by doing 3-year grow out contracts. So the growers have that, you know, they know what they're going to be supplying, and then we can set our specs around that. So we've, you know, got specs around size, root to shoot ratio, all that kind of stuff. But what I want to start getting into is talking about seed zone. So this program started around 2005, and up until 2017, the seed zone was the Tualatin Basin. So we would call that, you know, as locally practical as I could imagine it being, just because we're working in a really fragmented landscape and trying to get remnant populations to collect from. In 2017, it was expanded 120 miles to the south to the Willamette Valley at the Ecoregion 3 level. And, you know, this was done to bring in more diversity, and also with like this thinking about bringing things further from the south. We also only collect seed from lower elevations. So now I want to talk a little bit about the local context for climate change in native plant communities. I think, you know, I've heard a lot of good talks this week, and the big reason why I wanted to come here and share what I've been working on is to also be able to hear from everybody else. I think Tom Kay's talk on the first day did a good job of setting up some of this. But what we're experiencing in Northwest Oregon, even with a mesic climate, is that annual temperatures are going to be increasing, more frequent extreme events, heat domes with temperatures 110 degree plus for a week. But the annual precipitation isn't changing that much, but when it's falling is something that we're seeing changes around. So during the hot, dry summer, we're seeing less of what was already very little rain. Local impacts to native plant communities, so decline in iconic Pacific Northwest species, Douglas fir and western red cedar. Western red cedar, we're at the southern end of its range. I don't think there's a full autopsy on what's going on with western red cedar, but it's definitely not doing well in more exposed sites. Douglas fir, there's, I think, a much larger story there, but like ours locally is some of the lower elevation locations, it's just not faring very well. I think there was some range expansion over time. What I'm seeing as a manager, though, is increased mortality of planted seedlings. So I showed you that picture of how we're using bare root seedlings. We're not irrigating. We're not investing a lot in each plant. This is a method that's worked out really well for us. But a seedling is one of its most vulnerable times, you know, to increased climate. So we are seeing more mortality in our plantings. And another thing that's going on is that land managers like myself are already kind of starting to adjust what they're doing based on, you know, input from, you know, experts, nursery people, what's available. So we're already kind of getting beyond just sourcing from the Willamette Valley. Okay, so native plants are key to what we're trying to accomplish. Climate change is already here. It's really complicated. And so what could a path forward look like? So I'm a, you know, local kind of small scale restoration practitioner. And what I'm going to talk about next is kind of how we've kind of worked at this question in phases, kind of kicking the can down the road on some of the things and getting some things going. So phase one, I call this scope development. This is kind of the scratching your head part of it, where it's easy to get kind of paralyzed. I started talking about this with some other colleagues in 2019 and 2020. we started seeing these presentations about the seed lot selection tool. It sounded great. It sounded promising, really fun. I do encourage people to get familiar with it and play around with it, even if you aren't comfortable with the idea of moving species far away. So around that time also is when I saw Tom Kay with the Institute for Applied Ecology give the talk similar to what he gave Monday, and that's where I kind of saw like a bit of a path about how we could try to bridge theory to application. And we got to talking about this, and we kind of quickly settled on, well, this seed lot selection tool is this shelf-ready thing. Let's play around with it and see what we can make sense out of. It is, like I think I've heard a couple people mention, there's a lot that you can do, and there's definitely a fear that you could get things wrong. But we settled on two key variables, so mean coldest month temperature and the summer heat moisture index. And really the way we got those is through just talking with one of the authors. And he was familiar with what we were trying to do and our local kind of realities. So he said, use these. That I realize that might not be a resource that's available to everybody, but I have since seen there's a paper here, and I've seen some of the speakers at this conference are co-authors on it. And maybe that's too small for you guys to see, but that citation in the bottom left, if you look up, Brad Sinclair and I can't even read it on my own slide. Seed lot selection tool and climate smart restoration tool, web-based tools for sourcing seed adapted to future climates. Super helpful. There's some case studies in there, and you can kind of read those, see how people were applying it, and think about your own situation. The output of the seed lot selection tool, so we've got, the mid-century and late century on the left and the right. And I'm going to speed up and talk a little bit quicker now. But yeah, we did the more pessimistic 8.5 scenario also. So what we got from the SST was kind of a continuous output. The color ramped version you're seeing, that is the mid-century scenario. So the darker the green, the better match it was. There's also some hashed lines that hopefully you guys can see. That's the later century, so the 2071 to 2100. We overlaid those in GIS so we could kind of look to see, are there areas where both were matching up? And there were some, and that's probably because we actually combined two seed zones. So we have two seed zones that kind of cross right through the Tualatin Basin. We also split up this continuous output into 3 regions. They have distinct character based on like north-south, how close to the ocean it is, and just kind of makes it easier to think about this when you move to operational. All right, so then phase 2, this is where we did the survey. So what's growing in these places that we're identifying as climate analogs? The way we handled this is we weren't happy with what we were seeing from just looking at pre-existing data, so we went and created new. The same guy that monitors our projects for effectiveness, very familiar with our basin. He spent most of a summer kind of going around to these climate analogs. There's definitely limitations to this in terms of the amount that you can survey and the places you get access to. But that was the route that we chose, and we're looking to back that up with maybe some data that covers a wider area. There was some, edaphic or local climate factors that we excluded also. So you have to take this tool and then like really think about what it's doing and make it work for you, I guess. Get all this data back. What are we going to do with it? We just kind of looked a lot at, how prevalent are things in our analogs? How prevalent are they here? I've got a list of the species. These are all trees and shrubs. Remember, we're trying to grow shade. The species in yellow, those would be ones that we're looking at potentially extending outside of their current range. Got a minute left. This is we're in progress right now, designing the common garden, conceptual model for species selection. Gonna move faster. This is also doing this right now, seed collection, phase 5. Some folks in this room are involved with this. We've got people out collecting 3 populations per climate analog region for a common garden, including one in our local Tualatin Basin. You can see that there. We're going to be growing this material out 2024 and 2025 at one of Clean Water Services properties. establishing these gardens in places that were going to be projects anyway, and then monitoring and refining the guidance. And I am not going to get into this that much, except for saying that we are not looking at replacing everything that we're not replacing local with this. We're looking at basically bringing in small amounts of these climate analog seed sources, mixing it in with the local stuff that we're doing at a commercial scale, and then also trying to develop the local stuff that we're kind of focusing on collecting in bad years, harsh locations, and also trying to eliminate some of the forces of kind of going through the nursery process through doing some more experimentation with direct seeding and maybe loosening some of our nursery specs so that we're getting more resilient genetics, hopefully, instead of ones that just do well in the nursery. Yeah. These are, we're looking at this broadly. So we're going to be collecting 24 species, but I think that over time we could be adjusting the levels of this based on, grouping these species functionally or looking at them individually. I don't know. I took this picture when I was walking around at the mall. This is the sequoia tree on the Capitol grounds, just to show a little bit of, at least awareness of the humility. So this is a, prime example of maladaptation where they planted a sequoia and it doesn't look so good. So I think I'm done though. Yeah. Yep. So when we went and surveyed there originally, there was some of that, but honestly, that was mostly on the contractor was Stillwater Sciences for that. The person that's doing most of the seed collection is up here, so Vanessa with the Understory Initiative, and please, yeah, I would like that a lot. Yep. Yeah, and that's another thing is, the people that are going out and collecting the seed, we're not just collecting seed, we're collecting site characteristic data. So if we see things in the common garden, we can kind of go back and revisit that. So the seed collectors that are going out are knowledgeable, thoughtful people, I would say. Not right now, no. Yep.
I just wanted to say about the comment Francis made about the DNA marker work. That's not planned right now, but we will have this living collection that can be sampled at some point in the future. So we look at that as a real option.
Yep.
Do you see any value in shifting the timing of your berry plantings, or is that not really in the equation?
We've talked about that some. So there's this phrase I've heard called like a hot lift, essentially, where you're not waiting for the plants to go dormant and you're just kind of digging them up and then taking them out to the field. So that would be, for us, that would be probably like a November, December time period. Logistically, it's hard. So if we're putting out 500,000 plants, that's probably going to like 80 different little projects and funding codes. So we definitely have to work within, telling people your property boundary and your fence lot, is only so important so that we can scale up some of this a little bit more. But that's one thought. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, our final speaker is Megan Clark from the University of Colorado in Denver and the Denver Botanic Gardens. She will be presenting on common garden experiments of grassland species to inform seed sourcing decisions for ecological restoration.
Hi, so yeah, my name is Megan. I'm a graduate student at CU Denver, and so this project was done in collaboration with the Denver Botanic Gardens and Bureau of Land Management. And this is largely my master's thesis work, so I'll be presenting some of our results from that. So this is not a new concept to anybody. Restoration is, the need for restoration is increasing all of the time. This is certainly happening in grassland ecosystems for many reasons: agriculture, conversion for croplands, energy exploration, changes in disturbance regimes, so wildfires, and a lot of invasives. So of course, as the need for restoration has increased, so has the need for native plant materials, which has led to the ultimate question of where do we source these plant materials from? So just to give a little bit of context, we are working in the Front Range of Colorado, and Colorado has grassland ecosystems all throughout the eastern side of the state, east of the Rocky Mountains. And so I know the map is a little bit, well, it's probably a bit bigger up there, but it's a bit small to read. But so everything east of that kind of green section of the Rocky Mountains is grassland ecosystems. And so we're looking largely at short grass prairie ecosystems, which is that kind of that lighter yellow-green color. And then actually this map is also showing further east, all of that sort of peach orange color is land being used for agriculture that was once grassland ecosystems. So it's really kind of showing the extent of loss of these ecosystems and biodiversity in grasslands. So restoring landscapes in grasslands comes with some unique challenges. Some of these have been talked about a lot in the dryland restoration talks that have been going on. So again, lots of competition with invasives, particularly those annual grasses that we see. Seeding recruitment and establishment is notoriously low, largely due to just drier conditions and low precipitation. There's a lot of variability in climate across these landscapes, so not all grassland ecosystems have similar climates, and so that creates a challenge. And then climate change as a whole, with increased temperatures and more variability in annual rainfall and increased drought conditions, presents a challenge as well. And so that leads us to the question of how do we mitigate these challenges? And so, the idea is to use this genetically appropriate and locally adapted seed to give our native species the best chance possible at succeeding in our restoration projects. So when we talk about local adaptation, this is certainly not a simple concept. There's a lot that goes into local adaptation in a particular species. Some of these factors, so all of these factors, these are just some examples, contribute to local adaptation in a particular species, and that can relate to characteristics of the species itself and also characteristics of its habitat and the landscape it lives on. And all of these factors can vary species to species, so you can imagine there is a lot of complexity and a lot of research needs to be done on specific species so that we can understand how local adaptation presents in commonly used restoration species. And so for our project, with the lack of species-specific information, we are using provisional seed transfer zones to guide our analysis. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this map. We are located in Denver, so I don't know if you can see that little star, like right there. Is where our common garden is, near Denver, Colorado. And this is the seed zone that we are located in. And so you can see out west the just extreme diversity of climates and how you can be, sometimes 50 kilometers away from a restoration site and suddenly be in a different seed zone. So this matters quite a lot when you're looking at seed sourcing for restoration. So our project was a multi-year common garden study. We have just completed the first year of this, and we are looking at short and mixed grass prairie ecosystems, looking at answering the question, to what extent do native Colorado grassland species display local adaptations? That's kind of our big idea with this project. And so I'm just going to kind of give you a snapshot of it. These are two of the species that we planted, Ericameria nauseosa, also known as rabbit brush, and Bouteloua gracilis, also known as blue grama. These are both dominant species in this ecosystem, and they are also both commonly used in restoration. So for our rubber rabbit brush populations, we sourced all of our seed from, or used all of our seed from SOS collections, Seeds of Success. We acquired these through the Bureau of Land Management. And so for our populations are essentially collections, different collections, and each of these points, and some of them I know are overlapping, but there are 20 of them. Each one is a population for the sake of our study. And so we have the same thing for blue grama. We have 21 populations for these, which is 21 collections, again, from Seeds of Success collections. So we sowed our seed into germination trays in a greenhouse and let them germinate there and grow into these plugs and these trays, and they were transplanted into the field after about 2 to 3 months of growing. So we planted plugs, we watered them, and let them establish, and then collected data thereafter. And so this is what our site looked like before. So this is just bare ground. Nothing was out there. And this is a few months after planting. And so you can see they did quite well and got quite big. Our Ericameria are there, and our Bouteloua are here. So you can see that here. Ericameria, Bouteloua. So they did pretty well. They were pretty happy. So in our first year of data collection, our goal was to look at, again, post-establishment performance of different seed sources. So we looked at traits after these plants established in the ground, these individual plants. And we wanted to know the extent of interspecific variation in these two species, specifically looking at these 4 traits. I'll be talking about a couple of them later. And then we also wanted to know if the variation within or between those source populations could be contributed to or correlated to certain environmental factors. And so these are the ones that we looked at there. And again, I'll talk about some of the more significant ones in our results. So what did we find? When we looked at different populations, this is specifically comparing height between Bouteloua gracilis. And we did see variation between our populations. So this is organized from lowest, median to highest, and we had about a difference of 12 centimeters in the median. So our lowest population, our smallest populations had a median about 12 centimeters, and our tallest plants and our tallest growing population had a median of about 25 centimeters. So we did see some decent variation amongst populations. And then the next graph over in the green is the same populations grouped by seed zone. So the same populations, and you can see that they also had some variation, but when they're grouped like this, they were performed a bit more similarly. And so here highlighted, I have what we determined as our local populations. So with the population graph, we've highlighted the populations that were sourced within about 30 kilometers of our common garden. And the seed zone that is highlighted is the seed zone that our common garden was located in. And so we can see that these populations, or these groups, our local groups, did fairly well, but they didn't necessarily consistently perform better than other populations. And so the next thing I want to look at is phenology. And so we had some interesting patterns in flowering time in the species. So here we have the number of days until flowering from planting. So again, grouped by population, and then those populations grouped together into seed zones. And so again, we have our quote unquote local within about 30 kilometers, these particular populations, and then the seed zone that our common garden was located in. And so these had some interesting correlations to particular source climate factors. So one of our strongest predictors was minimum winter temperature, and this is one of the factors that goes into creating those provisional seed transfer zones. So here again, we have mean height. Each of these is a population, and so mean height for each population was fairly strongly predicted by mean minimum temperature of your source location. And so this association is predicting warmer source climates increasing biomass, which generally when we think of larger biomass, we think of higher performance success, right, with long-term survival and reproduction. So this has implications for restoration success in that way. But now if you're thinking about Beth Ledger's talk, right, smaller could be better in some situations. But the idea here is that if this is a strong relationship that we're seeing consistently, we can predict what the size is going to look like based on where we're sourcing our seed from. So if you want smaller, then we know where to source from. If you want bigger, then we know that too. So this is helpful in that instance. And so for context, this line is representing the climate conditions of our common garden. And so again, we don't necessarily see higher performance or increased size in relation to that value. If we did, we would probably, right, we would see more populations having either significantly higher, significantly lower biomass at that particular line. And we didn't really see a strong relationship with that. So we have the same thing for the mean number of days until flowering. So again, this is looking at phenology. And once again, this is very strongly correlated with mean minimum winter temperature of the source climate. Warmer climate is predicting a later flowering time in this case, which again has strong implications for species interactions and outcrossing. As you know, phenology plays a very important role in restoration and population success. So yeah, this is very useful in just understanding where we're sourcing from does have an impact on when species are going to flower, when populations are going to flower. And so again, we have this line that's representing where our common garden was, and so didn't see necessarily particularly strong associations with our local climate. And so we did the same analysis for Ericomeria nauseosa, and since I have a little bit of time, I can talk a bit about this. Same analysis, and we saw very similar patterns where, again, flowering was related a lot to minimum winter temperature, and in this case, we saw elevation was actually more strongly, height was more strongly correlated with elevation. But again, we saw pretty strong variation between populations and seed zones in relation to height. And so you can see there I have the strongest correlations of our source environmental factors. And since I have a few minutes, something I found really interesting with specifically Ericomeria results, and this is largely speculation, but this graph down here where we're correlating, this is actually flowering rate correlated with minimum winter temperature. And something I found interesting was that populations that came from a warmer climate actually had lower flowering rates, whereas if you came from a colder climate, more individuals within those populations flowered in the first year. And so obviously this would require more testing, but something I found interesting was that Ericomeria is known to be a later flowering species. And so it makes sense, right, that if this holds the same pattern of individuals flowering later, if you come from a warmer climate, that you would see fewer individuals flowering in the first year if you're from a warmer climate because they didn't have that time to flower. And so I think this could have potential interesting implications because if you're sourcing from a warmer climate than your restoration site, you might get significantly fewer individuals flowering if they flower at all. So more testing would need to be done on this. We didn't get as much phenology data for Ericomeria, but this certainly has interesting implications. And so our main findings, this project was overall pretty successful. I think the lowest survival rate in any of our populations was still higher than 70%. And I think for blue grama, we didn't have any populations that had a survival rate of lower than 80%. So really high survival amongst all of our populations, which was really great to see. Variation was seen between populations. We didn't necessarily see those local populations outperforming the non-local populations consistently. And minimum winter temperature did appear to be a pretty strong environmental predictor of phenology in particular, but also of other performance traits. So this is, again, multi-year study. This was just the first year that we're looking at. So steps going forward, we're looking at molecular genetic variation between these populations as well. We are looking at different phases of life stages, so looking at germination and seedling establishment, and then also continuing to collect data on these individuals, looking at long-term performance. And that is all I have.
Are you collecting any kind of reproductive data like flower counts or anything along those lines?
Yeah, so for Bootaloo, we actually did get numbers on inflorescence count for individuals. And so that is data that we had. It didn't present it here. There was quite a lot of variation between populations for that particular trait, and there was some correlation to, I believe it was annual precipitation for that trait. It wasn't quite as strong as these relationships, but there was some correlation there to that.
Did you see any kind of the local effect in that case?
Similar to these traits where, there might have been some, we had some of our local populations definitely perform well, and maybe a couple of them did significantly better than others, but it wasn't consistent across the board. It was a bit throughout where some of them were sort of in the middle of the group, and maybe one or two were at the higher end. But for none of the traits that we looked at, was it really like a clear result of these local populations did significantly better consistently.
It would be good to talk to you later because I have a lot of thoughts about those patterns.
Great.
Did you know what the subspecies and varieties of Frischie collected?
We do not, and that is largely a result of these collections being seeds of success, and so some of them I do think maybe were keyed to variety, but certainly not all of them, and we don't necessarily know the extent of the accuracy of keying to the variety for these. So yeah, we don't know, unfortunately, to that extent, but it does definitely explain some of the large amount of variation that we would see, certainly. Yeah, so none of our analysis necessarily, we didn't have a hard line of categorizing local versus non-local. We did look at variation between seed sources, and so we did look at performance if within the same seed zone as the common garden. But another one of the environmental factors that we correlated to was geographic distance from the garden, so that was kind of our local test, and it really wasn't significant for any trait. Yeah. The ones that were highlighted up there were within 30 kilometers, though, if that's what you were asking.
Is there a lot of variability in geography, even regardless of distance? I was just wondering if sometimes distance could mean that you might go 100 miles and you hit a mountain range. So I don't know.
Right, yeah, and so that was kind of our idea with testing that geographic distance was kind of seeing if that as a baseline meant anything, and it was not super surprising that it didn't really, right, because you can move 50 kilometers or 100 miles or whatever and be in a completely different seed zone and environment, and so one of the other, elevation was also one of the factors that we tested, which had a little bit more significance with these traits, but not a ton. Anyone else? Great. Thank you so much.